Welcome back, everybody. In this week's video, we are going to create a jar out of a closed form using the collaring technique that we discussed in the previous week's video. So let's go ahead and get started. So I've been getting a lot of requests to create a closed form jar, and this is the easiest way to create a jar out of one piece of clay. Now in videos to come, I'll dive into creating a lid separate from the body, and that will be a whole different venture. But for now, we're going to dive into creating closed form using collaring. So using those techniques we used prior to this video, and we're going to be creating an indent in that closed form to create this thing called a flange, and then we're going to separate them, and then we're going to trim them so they can fit. So this is going to be a two-part series, one to throw and create it, second to separate and trim. Now the one tool that you'll need that is not the most common is a wooden tool, preferably. It could be any material, but something that has a nice 90-degree angle and that is flat and straight walled. So oftentimes people use chopsticks because they're very common and easy to get, and this creates a little indent. But I prefer using a clothespin. And the reason why I like the clothespin is because this height here isn't as tall as the chopstick. So when you create the indent, it doesn't create as much clay separation, which I prefer less, so that way you don't have this really tall flange. And I just take this apart by removing it from the spring, and then I have a single wooden clothespin, and I just take this, put it in my tool bag, so whenever I create this form, I have this ready to go. So that is the one new tool we'll need. So let's put this away and get started. So we got our clay here. This is about 2.7 pounds, about 1.2 kilograms. And before we get started, I just want to let you know the upstairs neighbors are creating quite a lot of noise, and there's some construction going on outside. So I apologize for the ambient noise beyond my talking and the wheel. All right, anyway, we got our clay. Let's go ahead and get this centered as always. And in the comments, if you would like me to skip this whole centering process in future videos, please let me know, and we can jump into the good stuff. Anyway, these steps will never change because you always need to do this as you get started. So get it sealed. First step, push down, and then coning up and down. And the clay weight that you use, you can use whatever weight you are comfortable with. Just keep in mind the smaller or lighter amount of clay you use, or less amount of clay you use, the smaller the jar will be. So I find 2 pounds is a good starting point for most jars anyway. And it's good to practice with a little more, because if you make it really tiny, it can be a little difficult for you to get this made. Let's go up and down again. And then width of your piece. So I like the width about as wide as my knuckles. So your width is really up to you, but I just throw a normal cylinder because we can always make it narrower later. All right, let's go ahead and dig my well. And these setups are more or less all the same. And then you want, if you're going to make a foot for this, 1/2 inch at the base. If you're going to make no foot, you can go as thin as a 1/4 inch. All right, so I got my base set. Let's go and do my first pull. All right, so this pull, I'm going to do the squeeze and lift. So open, squeeze, and then do the pull. And this is done at my 4 o'clock, so I'm squeezing my left hand to get it to rise. And then on the overhead cam, you can see the slope developing here. So let's go ahead and open this up before I start my next pull. And then clay thickness, we want to keep it a little on the thicker side because we will need to trim it. So we'll go 3/8 first, and if we need to thin it out later, we can. All right, it's starting to open up wider. Let's do our first collar, and we'll do the Kamehameha technique, or the 2 C's with both hands. If you want to see more ceramic videos, don't forget to like and subscribe. That way it helps grow the channel and you'll be able to see these videos as they're released every week. And then we're going to go thin out the bottom and do another pull. Push out, push in, compress, and then pull. Release the pressure as you rise. And I'm just getting a straight cylinder for now. And trying to keep that thickness all the way through. So we got our cylinder set up and we are ready to start collaring this in to make it into a closed form. So a few tips and things to think about when you start bringing this in. You don't want to start too high because as you collar it in, you may run out of clay by the time it gets too close. And then if you need to thin it out, if it's really thin, chance of it cracking become higher. So I do recommend going about 1/3 of the way down when you start your collar. And it's okay to keep your top a little thicker because you always can thin it out as you close. So before you start, just make sure your inside is more or less dry. You don't want any water stuck in there because that can cause the inside to crack. And then ideally you should have this more or less 90-degree angle from where the clay wall meets the floor. I have a slight slope, so I could adjust that, but for demo purposes, I'm going to start making the shape. And the outside, you can clean this up after you close it, or you can clean it up before you close it. I'm going to clean it up after I close. So let's go ahead and get the collaring. So whenever you need to add water, make sure you only add it to the outside of the clay wall. So I take my right hand, get the side of the sponge on the rim, and I just squeeze, and then my finger can more or less kind of spread it across that opening. And we're going to go ahead and start collaring. So let's get our fingers wet. And a few ways to collar, like we talked about. You can make 2 C's, squeeze and lift. You could do the gang sign with 6 points of contact, squeeze and lift. You could do the whole hand. For something like this, since I'm going to work on the third, I'm going to start with the C's because this is the most user-friendly. So I squeeze in. This is creating a slight neck. If I reduce and release the pressure, you can see that it's getting narrower. So I keep that same size, and I just slowly lift up. And then my thumbs are kind of pointed upwards like this, right? And so whenever you are closing something to make it narrower, always work your hands upwards rather than straight horizontally or down, because that can cause this shoulder here to collapse. And then from here, you basically just keep applying pressure and lifting up. As the clay gets thicker and narrower, don't forget to do some fingertip pulls. And then this is where you can kind of throw in a more advanced technique. If you can squeeze this and then lift it inwards at the same time, you can thin and compress at the same time. So it looks something like this. So I'm going to adjust my hands so you can see the way it looks. So I'm squeezing here. My left pointer finger is on the outside. And as I squeeze and thin, my left hand is tilting inwards. And it's actually making it more conical or more cone shaped. So now I have this weird looking cone shape, and I basically just got to keep closing this and making it tighter. So you just got to decide at this point how you want the top of your lid to be. If you want it nice and dome or pointy, you just close it higher up. If you want it more flat or less rounded, you start closing it further down. So I'm going to go in between the middle. This is kind of a nice middle ground. Closing it to make it pointy is the easiest, but that can make your lid look a little weird. So I'm going to work on the top, and this time I'm using that 6 point of contact or that gang sign to really compress and then of course lift up. And so you can see the shoulder starting to form, and I can make that more angular if I want later. So this is where I'm going to work it on first, is get this narrower. So I'm going to go ahead and start collaring again. So I'm going to go ahead and start pinching and thinning. This time my left pointer finger on the inside, very similar to how I did it on this side. But this time I have my pointer finger on the outside. And then this time, this pointer finger is helping to keep the clay more or less centered and compressed. So let's go ahead and do that one more time so you guys can see that, since I did that rather quickly. So I'm opening it up, compressing the lip for you folks so you can see it. So at this stage, to recap, you can just thin the clay out and keep closing, or you can try to do a thin and close at the same time. So I'm basically doing a fingertip pull, but this time my pointer finger is on the inside, middle finger on the outside, and I'm just kind of pinching with these two fingers and moving my hands inward and upward. And my right hand is also doing the same on the outside. So it looks something like this. And it does feel weird. So it does take a little while to get used to. And then I'm going to stop right as the clay is as wide as my finger. And so one tip that I have found out by watching many Instagram videos is this inside. You want to try to remove as much of the wet clay as possible, because that can cause your clay to crack as it dries. So just jam your sponge in there, soak it up. Sometimes you may get this weird flare like how I did, but then we just got to close it up a little more. So tighten it. And a lot of this clay here, actually I'm just going to end up pinching away. And so now I'm just going to squeeze this neck tighter and tighter, and all the clay above it is just going to pinch and disappear. Okay. And you may be thinking, oh, why didn't you save that for your handle or your knob? And actually I'm going to attach the knob when we trim so that I can shape it exactly how I want it. So this we can just grab. All right, and there we go. We have our closed form. And it looks kind of weird because we have this weird steps. So before I adjust any more out here, I'm going to go ahead and really just more or less funnel the clay towards the center to do a little more compressions. And from my experience, this helps reduce the amount of cracking that could occur, and it just really aligns the particles to make it nice and strong. All right, so we got a dome, and at this stage you can make your indent here to create the flange. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off all the extra slip, and before I actually start making the flange to create the closed form, I want to clean this up. So this is where another tool comes in. In this case is the rib. This is a silicone rib. This one's by Mud Tools. They're not the cheapest, but they are pretty flexible. They come in different colors with different softnesses, and so the green I think is around the more medium stiffness. So anyway, treat it like a trimming tool. And what I'm doing is I am starting from the curve and I'm moving the tool inwards towards the center, kind of like how I did my hand. And what this is going to do is just remove any unwanted bumps and really round and smooth out my surface. And so I do recommend doing this before you do anything else, because once you create the flange and it's ready to cut open, it's a lot harder to clean it up. So take your time, do some cleaning stages, and the top, whatever shape you want. If you want it flatter, you just compress more, but before I move on to that, I'm going to adjust the outside. And a cool thing about creating a closed form, this is more or less a balloon. So if I squeeze on the sides or apply pressure, it's going to push the air and expand the top. If I compress the top, the air is going to move and expand the belly. So just keep in mind, you don't want to play around with it too much when you're first learning this technique, because it can cause it to make weird bulges in some places, and it's hard to fix if the clay is a little more worn or too thin. So that's why I recommend creating it at 3/8 of an inch for your first one, so you can get a hang of creating this closed form. Anyway, I'm creating this straight wall because the straighter the wall you have, the easier it will be to create the indent for the flange. And I'm gonna push the flange in basically where the transition starts from the vertical wall into the curve wall. So I'm kind of figuring out where I want that to be, but I do want to flatten this out a little more. So as you can see, as I'm pushing down on the top, you can see the belly start to expand outwards. And this part is all personal preference, how much you want to push and shape. I just didn't want my lid to be too rounded. I want it more flat. So I'm just rounding that out. And then this curve right here, I'm actually going to switch now to the metal rib so that I can really get that edge a little more defined. The silicone rib was a little too rigid. So now I've got my metal rib, hold it with two hands, flex it to the shape that I want this to be. And you can really see that nice edge form on the outside. All right, and then that's where my flange is going to be. Before I do that, I'm going to do one more pass with this tool. And the metal rib will take and scrape a little more off the surface so you can get a little more of a final shape versus the silicone rib tends to just kind of push the clay from one spot to another. All right, I got my piece more or less set up. I'm going to be pushing in right here where this edge line is created, so basically where the vertical wall meets the curve. When you do this and you try it for your first time, making it on a curved, your flange on a curved wall section is not the easiest. It can be done, but it requires more trimming for it to sit later. So I do recommend pushing it in on the straightest edge first. So right there. So now this is where your chopstick comes in, or clothespin, or popsicle stick, or any sort of material that is rigid and it has a nice straight 90-degree angle edge. So I like using the clothespin. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the clothespin, I'm going to hold it in my right hand like it is a trimming tool. I'm going to brace that hand with my left, and I'm just going to apply inwards pressure right here on that line. Now it's really important to ensure that this does not drift up or down, and you want to make sure this stays as straight and perpendicular to the bat as possible, meaning you don't want this angled inward or outward. And then amount of pressure you push in. You want to go about halfway into your clay wall. So one thing I forgot to do, which I should have mentioned as I was throwing it, is remember how thick your clay wall is. Mine was about 3/8 of an inch, so about that thick. So thickness wise, or indent wise, I want to push it in about that much, so about half the thickness, or a little less than a quarter. Okay, so I got my tool, and then I'm going to go ahead and then start pushing it into that edge, just like if I was trimming. And you can start seeing that indent form. So this is called the flange. And you keep pushing until you have that thickness that you're aiming for. In this case, a little less than a quarter inch. And as you're doing it, it will create this extra clay coming out. So how you want to get rid of that extra clay is up to you. You can just use a sponge if you want, and then blend that clay down into the bottom. You could use the metal rib to scrape it. You could use a trimming tool to remove it, but it's really up to you. But I do recommend removing it every once in a while so you can see the true edge. It's more important to see the thickness on the bottom here in relation to how the indent is. I use that as my gauge. Okay, so keep pushing it in. That's starting to develop. You can also use a trimming tool at this stage, if you have that handy, and then light pressure on that flange lip that's creating, and just trim it away, and then peel. Here, so I'm almost ready to start the next step. Now you don't need to keep removing it. If you want to leave it as is, you can always trim it when it's drier. And for that recommendation, I'm just going to leave it now. All right, indent looks pretty good. I'm going to go actually a little deeper just to be safe. So this lip right here looks like about 1/2 inch, but if I were to remove this flange that's also developing on the outside, it's closer to that 1/4 inch goal that I want. So I'm actually gonna stop there. The top I'm not too worried about because I can clean that up later. So there's a few things to adjust before we cut this off the bat. And the first thing is I'm gonna get rid of this extra clay off of the bottom, so the skirt. So I'm gonna take my wooden knife, and just like how I did in the other videos, have the blade facing the direction of the wheel spinning. So wheel spinning this way, so the wheel should hit the blade. And then I'm gonna stand it up to the angle that I want, and I'm just going to push straight down until I hit the wheel. There we go. Then I take my needle, slide it into that little groove that I just made until I see it in the insert, slice, spin, and peel. All right, so my bottom is nice and clean. I'm going to create a little indent at the bottom so that the wire has somewhere to go into. So I spin slowly and pull the wire towards me. There we go. So before we can let this dry out naturally, we have to poke a hole somewhere in here so that the air can escape. And the reasoning for that is as the clay dries, it will shrink. And if the air is stuck in there, the clay will shrink around the air, but the air will push back, causing it to crack, most likely where you sealed it. So there are places that you can poke the hole, and that is usually on the top, the area where you cut for the flange, or the sidewall. So most likely, if you saw this before, people usually recommend to poke it in the sidewall because that's where you're going to cut. Now, as someone who's doing it for the first time, I don't really recommend that because if you poke a hole in there and when you cut it, that can cause some issues when you open it up. Another place you can poke it is the sidewall so the air can escape. That's the easiest, but that can be seen if you don't seal it up perfectly after you trim. The one I prefer, because I'm actually going to attach a knob to this when it's in the trimming consistency, is to poke a hole in the top. So if I poke a hole in the top, the air can escape. That usually prevents cracking from occurring, and we will be able to attach a knob on there to seal it. And if cracks do form on the bottom, we can easily seal that up later. So I'm just going to take my needle, push it into the center, and then I'm going to do that one more time. This time I'm going to kind of make a little circular motion to open it up a little bit. And I'm going to do it a third time because I don't want any of the clay as I pull it out to seal and close it back up. So now that I got my hole on the top, it is wired off. I am ready to let this dry to leather hard. And once it's that dryness, I can cut this to separate it. I can then trim the lid and the jar until they fit nicely. And then I can attach the knob on the lid or the handle, whatever you want to call it. And then finally trim the bottom if that's something you want. So if you want to see that video, please don't forget to like and subscribe so you can see that happen when that video comes out, because I do have to wait for this to dry. So I hope you liked this video, and I'm excited to get this finished so we can have our first closed form jar. Until then, thank you for watching as always, and I'll see you in the next video.